So, I mean, that came across very much. And, the government keeps emphasizing that the Atmanirbhar strategy is not a strategy that is meant to be isolationist. It's meant to be a strategy of engaging with the world, of building a strong export-oriented sector. That was repeated again in the budget speech today. But the reality is that the most visible element in the Atmanirbhar strategy has been import tariffs. And that is, if you ask me, against engagement with the world and against a much more competitive industry in the long run. I hope we will see that start to change with the new customs duty environment that we've been promised later this year.
Hmm. I was speaking with Vinayak earlier, Mr. Forbes, who was happy to hear about the DFI being set up for one, and of course the capex guidance that the government gave out at 5.54 lakh crores. Did you like what you heard on infrastructure, or do you feel over there as well what was missing was details on implementation?
Well, I mean, I suppose a budget is limited by how much detail can be put in on implementation. It's good to hear about the new infrastructure institution being set up. That sounds like a good move. I think the pipeline actually is now quite significant for infrastructure. A lot of that pipeline actually will be actually implemented by state governments. And I think if we see the actual funding of state governments by the union government happening in a much more generous way, as was promised by state, that will be very healthy, because I think that's what will actually provide a real fillip to actual infrastructure spending.
Wonderful to have you stop by and speak with me. Thank you so much for your time today, Mr. Forbes.
Thank you.
Market holding steady today. The banks are indeed on fire. Rashesh Shah of Edelweiss joins in. Rashesh, the market looks happy. Are you?
I think after today's budget, it came in very difficult times. If you look around, most people are happy. There are obviously some niggling details and all that people will query and may feel unhappy about. But overall, I think there are a lot of things in the budget that are there to feel happy about. I mean, I'm sure you've spoken about a lot of this on privatization, disinvestment, on FDI increase, on the 35,000 crores for the vaccine, which also I think is a very good start. The vehicle scrappage policy, a lot of this are going to improve structural demand in the economy and also help us put COVID behind us and get to. We do believe that India is on a 5-6 year growth path now, and that the medium long term growth is only going to be restored with this particular budget.
Up two of those topics, Rashesh, FDI and insurance. That's a big one, is it not? Does that really open up potential for that sector, you think?
Yes, as you know, we need capital. We need a lot of capital from abroad. We need a lot of investments from abroad. So I think this FDI and insurance is good because this allows the insurance sector to grow faster. Insurance sector is very capital intensive, and this kind of long-term equity capital in India is only so much. And if we have already allowed 74 in banking, so I think insurance was waiting to be asked that. But with this extra capital that the insurance companies will get, I think insurance companies will play a big intermediation role in really channelizing household savings into long-term investments. And I think that we have to use the market mechanism, the insurance companies. I do believe that we have overused the banking sector, and even hence, setting up a bad bank and all can only go so far because a lot of this require market-related answers through the bond market, through AIFs, and through others because they don't burden the banking sector. The banking sector is very burdened because they take deposits, but those deposits are on call overnight, and that puts a lot of burden on the banking sector to take risk for long-term investments in the economy.
Hmm. What ramifications does this have for the LIC IPO, though, Rashesh? And generally, in terms of how LIC is run, it is sort of the last man standing when the government needs it. Will that have to change?
Uh, I don't think so. I don't think this impacts the LIC IPO much. I think, as I said, this will increase investment in the insurance sector, because most insurance companies are currently strategic partnership. They are JVs, and most of the foreign partners already own 49%. So there is no real foreign capital that can come in. But when you increase foreign holding to 74, a lot of the portfolio investors, a lot of the FIIs can also come into insurance companies. And I think even for LIC, though LIC, I think even 10% of LIC is a very big number. So whether LIC was at 49 or at 74 will be an academic conversation. But I think it does reignite a lot of interest and investment opportunity in the insurance sector, and B, allows the insurance sector to play as big a role as the banking sector has done in capital formation and channelizing capital for long-term growth in India.
Mm. You have a deep understanding of the primary market, of course, Rashesh. On that disinvestment figure, though, I didn't hear any fresh names in terms of disinvestment or privatization. Did you hear anything that you think the market will be excited by? As someone was pointing out earlier, Air India has been a 22-year story now in terms of selling that one.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. I think the ones which have already been announced, the Air India, the BPCL, LIC, all of them, they itself, I think, will allow the government to meet the disinvestment or the privatization target that is there. Again, I think there are two parts. There is disinvestment and there is privatization. I think the disinvestment, I personally think on a long-term basis, this getting 1.5, 2 lakh crores a year is a very small number. I think government needs to go towards 4 to 5 lakh crores a year, and that can only happen through massive privatization. So I think this announcing of a couple of banks to be privatized, LIC, disinvestment, at India, BPCL, all of that. I think this year numbers will get met, but I would have hoped for a long-term disinvestment privatization strategy, and I would have liked the government to say, you know what, we'll raise $300 billion over the next 5 or 6 years through disinvestment and privatization, because government, at the end of the day, has what I call a capital allocation problem. They've allocated a lot of capital to banks and Air India, and they need to reallocate it back to infrastructure and healthcare and education.
Hmm. As we have seen in the past, Rajesh, the market will do what it will do today. What is your sort of medium-term takeaway from what you heard today for the capital market and the fixed income market?
I think overall the faith in the Indian growth story has been restored, and it's not only today. I think last 3 months, because what happened around COVID time, especially between April to August, there was truly a questioning of COVID's impact on India, India's growth story, whether it has been derailed forever, all of that. I think since October, the foreign investors, the investors' confidence in India's growth story is coming back, and I think today's budget has only given has actually propelled that confidence further. So I think the part, because India appeals to investors only because of its growth, and I think on growth, I think we are now back on track. Today's budget has also enabled that, and that itself is going to bring a lot of interest in the market. Also, as we all know, global flows are good. The US dollar is expected to go down. A lot of interest in emerging markets. But amongst emerging markets, I think India's growth prospects now look the best.
Okay, let me add two more voices to this conversation. Sunita Reddy of Apollo Hospitals and Ravi Menon, CEO of HSBC Global Asset Management, join in. Welcome to both of you. Ravi, you've been listening in as a sort of co-player in the financial field. Are you feeling as happy about what you heard in the budget today, or some question marks?
Of intent. And I think the perhaps the big difference for all of us coming in it was we came in with a great deal of empathy for the finance minister in terms of what's the kind of policy initiatives and alternatives that she would have, considering it's such a difficult year. And I think within that, not just the statement itself, but the big difference in this year as opposed to the past is really laying out a roadmap. Rashesh did mention that he would like the disinvestment number to be quantified, but at least the statement of intent that there is a committee which is going to look and decide there are only going to be 4 in the strategic sector and the rest are going to be disinvested is clearly a very clear-cut statement of intent, which I think was missing in the past few years. The fact that you quantified this 1.75 lakhs is a start. It is actually lesser than last year's disinvestment target. But we know that some of the names in a buoyant market like this, including LIC, of course, the big ticket disinvestment, can quite easily achieve this. But what has not been quantified besides the disinvestment is the overall monetization. And I think that's been a very critical part which has not been focused on as much. Though we have seen during the last few months, we've spoken about InvITs coming in Power Grid and a few other very asset heavy public sector enterprises. And we have also seen in today's budget some level of tax changes and amendments coming into those capital market structures. So the more supply that you're coming in, we need to have more instruments in place. And I think that's a big positive. The biggest change, of course, is a very strong statement of intent in terms of the public sector banks and the candid assessment of two coming up for privatization. We have never heard this ever. I think all of us have been in the market long enough, never ever heard this. It's always been a holy cow. So I would definitely rate that as the biggest change which has taken place, along with one general insurance company. So I think it's a big positive from that sense. The markets, perhaps, I can see Anant has joined and he can speak about it more in terms of the additional borrowing and the 12 lakh crores and what that means. And the tenure is moved by what, 10 or 15 basis points. I've seen the corporate bonds are moved by what, 20 basis points just before I joined this call, which I think is largely okay, that it's not disruptive to the markets in terms of what that is. And finally, of course, the fact that no taxes have been changed and there is some certainty in the tax environment is clearly what's cheered everyone in terms of a common factor right across the spectrum. So overall, I think it's a big positive, and the markets are reflecting that sentiment.
There are some surcharges, though. Just waiting for more, details on that. Speaking of the bond market news, also in that the government has said they're working on bond index inclusion, and they hope to do part of the borrowing through the bond index. Ravi, what did you make of the asset reconstruction company that was talked about? Because that's a hot debate. There's enough people against that argument as they are for.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a very heated discussion, and there are points of argument on both sides. But finally, we had to take a decision, because the fact is that over the last few years, the financial services and the banks and the NBFCs have been impacted. And this halfway house of not doing anything while we were debating the options or two big options has now been addressed. Now, I think the whole, what needs to be seen is how is this going to be executed. There are enough examples on a worldwide basis where it has worked, and it's worked very successfully. But I think the positive is that decision has been made. Let's also bring in this point which was made on the development financial institution, going back to the days of ICICI and IDBI, and a very ambitious target of 5 lakh crores. Just to put things in perspective, Axis Bank today is about 6 lakh crores. PFC and RSE put together is, I think, less than 5 lakh crores. So it is an ambitious target, but as long as his intent is there to regrow and be very focused on that, I think that will definitely come through. So I think it's a tick mark on both, and clearly in the former, since there is a group which is a very strong view, I think execution of that will be the most critical factor.
Sunita Reddy of Apollo Hospitals is waiting by as well. Sunita, she was very clear about the fact that, health was her main thrust. It was literally the first item on her budget speech. What did you make of the big increase?
So I'm really happy that for the first time that they're looking at the health sector as crucial to the growth of the economy, because she started with the health. The allocation of 2,36,837 crores, of course, a sizable allocation, 136% over the last year. But the fact that this is going to be something that will be used over a period of time is something that we need to wait and watch. But what makes me happy is that the fact that the government is really, for the first time, really investing in creating healthcare infrastructure in both the urban and rural. And they're really preparing for what could be another pandemic, whether it's just virus-like things that happen, airborne diseases, but they're preparing for it through the creation of new labs, the creation of critical care centers all over the country. So I think it's going to put India on a strong footing when it comes to looking after the health of their citizens. And without that, of course, nothing that they do for the economy will have much meaning. So very important for the healthcare sector. What I feel that they could have done more is that, while they have done this infrastructure development fund, I hope that some of this can be used to create healthcare infrastructure. So the allocation of 20,000 crores, a good start. The fact that the loan book can go to 6 lakh crores over a period of time is something that healthcare should have an access to. I think the third perspective is that in everything that we've seen, last year's budget was more about reducing corporate tax, putting more money in the hands of the consumer, increasing consumer spending. But I think, the focus on creating jobs has somehow come through with the spending on infrastructure. And I hope that happens. I believe this budget is something that, India was really going through. The health of the economy was almost in an ICU, and now they've shown it rehabilitation. So it's rehabilitating the economy, which is a wonderful thing to see. And I think it's more of a, instead of a yearly budget, I think it's progress for the next 36 months. And we're seeing that in the fiscal deficit being lowered from 9.6% in the current year to 6.8, and with growth moving to 11.5% as mentioned by the IMF. So definitely something to cheer about, to appreciate.
On the amount allocated for the vaccine, did you find that a generous sort of allocation at 35,000 crores plus?
On the government's part, I think it's a very generous allocation. I believe that the responsibility for vaccination should not lie only with the government, that at some time corporates, private sectors, people who have the ability to pay should actually pay for vaccines.
Anant, I think, is still with us. Anant, I imagine you've had a chance to sort of scour through the budget documents quickly. Any other quick and new takeaways you'd like to share with us?
I'm going to be a broken record, Mithali. But genuinely, I think 2 points which I think are very, very good, and one area which a note of caution. So the first point, look, I was going to judge this budget on the basis of its credibility. And I think this budget has done an excellent job of making a clean breast of things. I used to write reams and reams of paper about all the accounting fudges that the last 3-4 budgets have gone through. I'm going to be unemployed now, and I'm so happy about it. What you see is what you get. And frankly, if the bond markets are reacting to the truth, it's being foolish. This is always the case. This is nothing new in this. They've just used the COVID-19 to come and make a clean breast of things. Now, why am I so excited about this? Not because of moral reasons. I just think the credibility of the commitments made for going forward just increases dramatically. It's going to be all out in the open for people to see. The shift to capital expenditure, the reduction in revenue expenditures, I think will now be tracked, and hopefully, therefore, and plus, of course, releasing of payments to the private sector, which used to be a big, way of fudging the numbers. Hopefully that will get taken care of as well. The second part, I completely agree with Sunita on what she mentioned about the need to create jobs and output. There's a lot of people clamoring for demand and demand stimulus. I think demand will come through. There is a K-shaped recovery. There are people who are going to spend, and it's already visible in the GST numbers, etc. Government spending is also holding up the last 2-3 months, and it's going to continue. The problem we had in the past was not demand, not consumption, not government spending. It was jobs and output. And with inadequate output, you can run the risk of inflation and run the risk of external imbalances and financial instability. So to that extent, I think this focus of the budget on capex, on infrastructure, on healthcare, education, sanitation, water, etc., I think it's excellent. You can't ask for more. It's also, like Ravi was mentioning, it's also put some focus on trying to revive the financial services ecosystem, which I think makes a lot of sense for getting into a position where we can get jobs and output. Now, the note of caution, Mithali, this is not over. It's a long, long marathon we have to run. Our potential is immense, but just making announcements in the budget does not help. Execution is going to be critical on multiple fronts. First off, we can't repeat the mistake we made in 2009-13, which is have stimulus without output and jobs. If we have a jobless, outputless consumption, 3-4 years down the road, we're going to face the same set of problems and we're going to repeat history. So that's the first risk. Real economy has to follow through with jobs and output. Good things are happening, labor reforms, PLI, etc. And we have to see and track how that pans out. Second thing, again, what Ravi mentioned, bad bank, you'll find 20,000 people who will criticize it. This new DFI, lots of people will wring their hands. Execution is going to be key. A bad bank, I think, can be a fantastic idea if executed well. Again, the devil lies in the details and on execution. So the way I'm going to track this, Mithali, going forward, I would give very high marks. I'm no industry guy, so I can, as an academic, I can give whatever marks I want, but I would give high marks to this budget. But now, up tumhare hawale, watan sathiyon, for the real sector, they have to take over. And I'm going to track things like, how core inflation, how IIP and domestic output, how employment, which is not looking good at all, that has to kind of pick up as well, and imports. If you're importing stuff at this point in time and demand and consumption is going through, it's bad news for us going forward. So I'm going to track these 4 things, but full marks to the budget. I couldn't have asked for more. Yeah.
I hope your students are listening about the bit about generous marking, Anant. In the meanwhile, the stock market is set for, I think, the biggest budget day gain since 2001. So big rally here underway, especially for the banks, as we've been saying, 6% rally over there. Rashesh, coming on that point that Anant was making about employment though, and you've steered the ship at FICCI, and there were many recommendations both from FICCI and CII to look at some kind of urban employment scheme and perhaps to do a little bit more on Narega. I didn't hear anything in terms of details on additional spending for Narega, and of course there was no outline of an urban employment scheme. How do you think that end of the problem will resolve itself? Because clearly that is a large problem at this point.
Absolutely. I think, there is only so much the government can do directly for employment. A lot of the employment creation will happen through indirect policies of the government. I think on that, the textile park idea is very good, because textile is a very employment intensive industry, and we have lost, globally, we have lost ground on textile. So we need to gain it back. So I hope that becomes another starting point where we make a U-turn on increasing our market share on textiles and hence create a lot of jobs. I think the other is housing is going to get a strong fillip. MSME is going to get fillip. These are the 3 or 4 large employment creations. Outside of farming, if you see construction, housing, textiles, MSMEs, all these are big creators of jobs. And I think the indirect impact on jobs may be much stronger. And again, along with jobs, we also need to make sure that the wages are adequate. In fact, in a lot of places, including on the NREGA, the problem is not job, it is the wages. If the wages are inadequate, it will not lead to consumption and prosperity after that. So we need to make sure that the jobs are well paying, they are long-term sustainable, they are not temporary contract jobs which have a lot of instability inbuilt in those. And those are the kind of jobs we need to create. And those can be created, I think, via housing, via obviously manufacturing, via retail, textiles, as well as through MSMEs. And that focus is there. Again, as I think it's a great budget, it's a great plan. A lot will depend on the execution, but I think as of now, at least the starting point is very encouraging, that we have got the plan out of the way, but always after the plan comes execution. And execution is both government as well as the economy and the private sector will have to execute.
The smaller details, just the basic details, right? Nothing to sweat over. Ravi, I wanted to talk to you about, for a second about global perception here, because that was the big takeaway for us the moment she finished with her budget speech, which was that it looked like for the first time in many years, the finance minister had chosen to just make a clean breast of it and come out clean in terms of core numbers, both what she said the fiscal deficit would end up at and what she guided to. Do you think that's important in terms of global perception as well, to be seen as being more transparent now with the situation as it stands?
No, I think absolutely, be it global or domestic, I think the clarity and the glide path is always welcome. For instance, I think the numbers show back to the FRBM target, and she didn't even mention 3.5. I think she said lower than 4 or 4.5 is going to be targeted by 25-26. So it's very clear that the plan is to have an expansionary budget, not just in this year, but going on till the next 4 years or so, which is a positive. So you know that that's the game plan which is there in place. Second, the biggest hindrance, irritant for everyone, particularly foreign entities, is what happens in the tax regime. And this 3 year and revision from 6 years is a big positive and will be definitely be very welcomed. Third, I think I haven't seen the fine print, but some of the sectoral numbers which are put in will become very important. Sunita mentioned on the healthcare and the numbers that we can look at. But closer to our own industry in the fund management business, Gift City has come up in the last few years. Significant tax concessions have been given. And genuinely, there is an opportunity of creating a hub of excellence in terms of fund management out of India, which today we have exported. Over the last 25, 30 years, we exported it to all the various financial capitals in the world. May not be the most labor intensive in terms of number of people, but definitely a much higher skill set, which we would like to come back. These are representations which we've been making to the government in terms of some of the tax changes which we were expecting. It may be in the fine print. I haven't seen it. I hope it's there. But there are avenues of certainty which will come in. Because let's take fund management, for instance. We cannot have a situation where we bring something into India, establish funds, and tomorrow some tax law changes. You can forget it. Then it's gone forever. So demonstration of that certainty and over tenor of policy, I think, is very important, and that's another tick mark that this budget is definitely provided, be it both the fiscal or the monetary side in terms of what we can expect.
Sunita, this one is not, it's not directly your ambit in terms of your industry, but one very clear wounded animal that came out of this entire pandemic was the services sector. You know what was happening with tourism and hospitality and allied spaces over there. Did you see or hear enough from the budget that will go on to ignite some kind of recovery in that space? Because as we were discussing, it was a clean sort of budget on the macroeconomic front, but not a very populist budget. What would you expect to see from the services sector over the next few quarters?
And I think on a long-term perspective, the fact that, for recognizing, first of all, that 55% of our GDP comes from the services sector, I do feel that a little bit more could have done for the services sector. While IT is on a good, they're on a good trajectory, much more could have been done for healthcare as well as the tourism sector, which is capital intensive and still in the services sector. This is common for both healthcare and the travel and trade industry. So, having seen that, I believe that what the government has done for manufacturing in terms of production linked incentives could be done, in terms of investment linked incentives. If that had been done for healthcare, I'm sure that much more investment will go into healthcare, which is what we need. Because for every one job that we create, there are four other jobs that we create in the ancillary sectors. And I'm sure this is the same for tourism, because they're valuable earners of foreign exchange. So maybe in this time frame, people in the finance ministry have done so much that it's time that we appreciate it. But I believe that going forward, we should put this case forward that services other than IT also need, they need to be sustainable, and they definitely can do so much for the country in terms of job creation and forex earnings.
Let me just take a pause over here to sort of recap everything in case you've just joined in. Today was the union budget. Big change in terms of fiscal deficit figures from the finance minister. Big jump as well, which came as a surprise. But what's important is that it looks like she has cleaned up the balance sheet, in the sense a lot of off-budget items have now gone onto the balance sheet, which is good news for anyone watching the framework of the economy. Disinvestment figures were put out, but not completely enough in terms of details. That is something one will have to watch out for. And of course, there was a lot that got explained for health as a space, big jump in expenses over there for the finance minister. Health will get a major boost, as will the vaccine rollout. Again, infrastructure also came up for clear focus. I think some of the real estate community has come away a little bit disappointed where they didn't see enough. There was some for affordable rural housing, but not a lot. And big blue or long list, I would say, of customs duty increases across various categories. So I think that one as well will require some greater identification and analysis. The stock market has taken all this news splendidly. The Sensex is up 4%, the Nifty is chugging with a 500 point plus rally. The banks are standing out in their performance today, almost a 2,000 point rally on the index itself, that's 6.5%. And I think at current running, we are set for an extremely important close for the stock market. The bond market has had a bit of a topsy turvy, 6.05 now on the benchmark yield. That's a lot for them to digest in terms of the borrowing program that was set out. Of course, importantly, for those who track the economy, the 15th Finance Commission was tabled as well, and some of those recommendations were noted. That's really the big takeaways at this point in terms of what the budget had to throw out. Rashesh, how would you expect the disinvestment calendar to move? I mean, for someone who's looking at this purely from a retail point of view, saying, what's interesting that's coming from the government stables into the IPO market, how do you think it's going to be structured over the next 12 months?
I think the most important one is going to be LIC. I think almost half of the targeted amount can be assumed to be from LIC. I think the other Air India and BPCL will not be IPO or public market. They will obviously be strategic disinvestment and sales. And even what the government is talking about, one insurance company and a couple of banks, a lot of that will happen not via the market. So I think from the market point of view, I think LIC is the most important disinvestment. Along with that, government may do small 5,000, 10,000 crores of OFS, secondary market offers for disinvestment. But I think the large part of, not just for this year, but going forward, government proceeds will come out of privatization or disinvestment by selling big stakes, controlling stake or large minority stakes to large investors, strategic buyers, all of that. I think this public market, the disinvestment will be only for things like LIC and maybe a few others. And I do think that that is a very important point, because I think selling 3%, 5%, 10% of a company in a market it's a good thing on a BAU basis. But we really need to embark on a massive privatization drive where government, as I said, can raise about $300 odd billion over the next 5 years. So I think for that we will have to sell large stakes into, and why should government be owning such large stakes in a lot of these companies? So I think this is a start of that, and I do hope that this goes on for the next few years. I personally think this year's target will get met, and whether it will get met or not is going to be dependent on LIC. But we do believe that this year in FY22, LIC IPO should happen.
Ravi, jump in on that, because only about 7 or 8 months back there was quite a bit of pushback on this idea of FDI and insurance, but here we are, 74% is here, and it looks like the insurance market is opening up. Do you think this is the time for the government to go more aggressively on the disinvestment front, because clearly it needs to fire on all engines possible in order to up its revenues?
No, absolutely. If I'm not mistaken, when we revised the insurance FDI stake from 26 to 49%, it came with the condition that the foreign partner will have no incremental rights, will not have any rights, as a matter of fact. It is a pure economic interest hike to 49%. So this going up to 74% is not just 74%, because if I heard the speech right, besides the fact that the key management should be resident and 50% Indian directors of Indian nationality, it is actually in terms of management control. So it is a big step up in terms of a far more progressive approach to ownership of what was considered and is, of course, critical Indian financial infrastructure. So that's a big move, a big critical step forward. And I think this gives an indication to investors that this is what one can expect to see. So I think it is critical. The big one, of course, is LIC, and the quantum is is potentially so large that a lot of the numbers that we are speaking of can be easily achieved because the markets can, if they're going to open up to this extent, can definitely manage that. In the past, to think of just debt and debt financing being used to put forth all the needs of the country is today far more challenging. That there is a cost attached to it. You see in bond markets, maybe marginal, but they have reacted to these numbers. How you get that growth while both equity and fixed income markets are largely stable? And it has to come out of the privatization, disinvestment, and there was an added statement, whether it happens or not, one doesn't know, where the state governments will be incentivized even to get out of the land banks which they have been created over long periods of time. So using what belongs to, I would say, being a bit dramatic, the common citizens is now getting back to them rather than just land being held or some corporate shares being held. It rather put it into healthcare and education today so that we can build for that future. So I think it's an absolute thing to do, and the biggest chunk being in financial services at this point of time, and that being put into the private markets is absolutely the right step. And something like this is, once a listing happens of LIC, is potentially a long-term ability to monetize and generate necessary capital for future. So I think it's a big step.
Anant, just one final question from you on how one should plot this in terms of, individual investment choices. As early as Friday, the Reserve Bank will meet. Expectations are there's going to be a little bit of a change in stance, and that is going to impact interest rates. Do you expect them to change? How soon? And how would you change, investing choices at this point?
So Mithali, look, let's look at RBI first. For the last couple of prints, we've got good prints on the inflation front. December was good. January is expected to be good as well, maybe closer to the 4% mark. That gives them some runway and breathing space in terms of staying accommodative into the next fiscal year. But look, any RBI governor's worst nightmare is a combination of high and persistent inflation, uneven real growth, external imbalances, internal imbalances, and financial sector instability, right? We are not there. We are not at 2013 or 2009 or whatever, but can we get there over a couple of years if the execution is not proper and if jobs and output don't follow? Absolutely, we can. So I think while the bond market is reacting to the borrowing program numbers, I think that's the wrong thing to react on, because this is just reflecting reality. What we should be reacting though is how inflation can pan out from here, and is there a risk that inflation can move up? Absolutely. On markets, Mithali, and allocation, look, I'm no expert, but I would think that equity markets, and Rashesh is here, so I'm kind of embarrassed to talk in front of him, but I would think equity markets would be supported right now. One is we've seen this deluge of foreign investors coming in. There's a lot of Indians who have kind of got out of the equity markets and are feeling probably hungry. There is going to be nominal GDP growth, Mithali. With all of this, consumption coming back and government stimulus, you are going to see nominal growth as well. So sectors like infrastructure, banking, etc., will probably do well. To that extent, even though, frankly, there is this big chasm between the real economy and market valuations right now, I guess one would want to stay invested in equity markets. Finally, long-term prospects, etc., Mithali, look, we are celebrating today because we were expecting a lot worse, and it's been a no harm kind of a budget in that sense. But we're getting back to where we were, a year back, which is not a good spot. There are still several sectors which are hurting, including things like real estate, including things like power, telecom, airline and shipping, MSMEs. The list is pretty long. So this is by no means the end. I mean, to quote Winston Churchill, this is no means the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It's the end of the beginning. Long way to go. And as Rashesh mentioned, execution risks are going to be very, very critical. So, don't hold your breath. This is a long inning. It's a test match. Long time to go ahead. Yeah.
Anant, you've let the cat out of the bag. Do no harm. I thought we went in expecting one in 100-year budget. I imagine all the corporates had their fingers crossed secretly while they were sitting down to listen to the speech. Dr. Krishna Ella of Bharat Biotech joins in as well. Dr. Ella, thank you for joining in, sir. We've got a figure in terms of the vaccine spend at 35,000 crores plus. Are you happy with what you heard in terms of what the government intends to spend on the vaccine rollout?
I mean, in the crisis, we never expected anything from the government. It's really honored to have that type of package. I think it's a very significant budget. It's just not because being a selfish, I don't want to say it's a 35,000 crores for vaccine. But look at the healthcare budget in general. I think it's a significant increase. We were lagging behind the healthcare earlier. I think this is the first time where the finance minister spoke about preventive, curative, well-being, and then nutrition. These are four different things. She spoke about it, and all four are very significant. I think this is the first time in healthcare budget is highlighted in the first time. And then I'm glad that 35,000 crores has been allocated for the vaccine field. And it's not the COVID vaccine alone, but I'm assuming it's going to be other vaccines, in childhood vaccines also included in that. So I think it's a good budget. And then coming to second point, I feel the government has allocated National Institute of Virology, like institute. 4 regional centers are going to be set up by NIV type of institutes. That's a good, or maybe Kerala may get one, or Assam may get one, and it looks like different geographic region where the pandemic issues can come up. So I think they're going to set up the NIV centers. That's another significant, and also they're going to have provision for BSL-3, sort of a laboratory facility that has been allocated again, predicting the future pandemic if anything happens. So how do we gear up as a country? That's another one. And I think, and also it's going to be strengthened National Center for Disease Control. It's like a CDC model, CDC of Atlanta, US model. They're planning similar model. That is another significant factor that future any epidemic is there, it can be strengthened in the country. And also I see another important game, National Research Foundation, which is very similar to National Science Foundation of US, where they allocated 50,000 crores. Earlier, when the money is given to the different department, they were spending the way the project was coming in. So the National Research Foundation will focus heavily on what is the national priority of the country is. So they're going to highlight probably the national priorities of the field, and that is going to be focused on this 50,000 crores for that, another significant factor in the healthcare issues. I mean, healthcare is one part, but these are all the ancillary things which are added to the healthcare issues. And your skill set, another one, the graduate students have been given a lot of privilege to have 5,000 crores. Engineering students and diploma students are going to be included. That is another significant factor. That's what I feel.
Dr. Ella, we've been through an extremely hellish year, though, and I think it showed up a lot of the cracks in the health infrastructure space as they stood. If you were to prioritize the spending amount and the increase that has been put out, what do you think the first port of call should be? Who needs it the most?
I mean, she has spelled out clearly the primary center and secondary healthcare, tertiary healthcare center. She put very clearly that defined. And so there is a 137% increase of the budget is going to go to primary and tertiary and secondary health centers. And also there is a specialty hospitals are going to be set up in different places. And that is going to take care of it also. I think it's emphasized, been given, budget is being allocated. I think it's going to be highlighted as we go along.
Sunita, same question to you. I mean, if you had to prioritize this in terms of, where you would want the spending to hit first, what would be right on top of that list? Because, many policy watchers have made this point saying, look, it's not enough to just increase the health spending. You have to be very specific when you're talking about health spending, particularly from the Indian context.
So I think the government did what it had to do. Like Mr. Ella said earlier, the focus on primary, secondary, tertiary, extremely important. CDC and setting up of labs to monitor such incidents in the future, extremely important. I think we've created one level of protection, but we need to go beyond that. And I believe the private sector has a huge role to play. So maybe the next budget will be more about incentivizing the private sector to make these investments so that that we can increase our infrastructure. As we know, demand supply gap, we have 9 beds for every 1,000 people, and this is really an area that sorry, 9 for every 10,000. So this is an area where the private sector has a role to play. The second, I'm extremely happy about the allocation to research and the focus on innovation. The next level of healthcare is not going to be so much about infrastructure. It is going to be about how we get closer to the consumer and how we create value closer to the consumer. So it's all about innovation. It's about digital health, and I believe that the government has made some progress. The private sector has made huge progress in these fields. We're also attracting funding into healthcare for digital health. So this is an important area that we created the foundation for. So I believe that yes, government has created very good. It's put the basics in place. It's up to the private sector now to take it further.
Dr. Ella, how do you think the money that's been allocated to the vaccine should be prioritized? I mean, at the start of the process, it looked like a mini PPP model in its own, where there was storage, there was transportation, there was ensuring protection, and of course, then there was the vaccination itself. How do you think this money should be prioritized through this entire pipeline, sir?
No, I think Indian vaccination strategies are all extremely good. You look at 25 million children, we are vaccinated with 7 vaccines. So that means the country of the 25 million children are giving 5 to 7 vaccines and reaching the whole year. So I think we have good strategies, good systems in place. Cold storage, what they wanted, they created now because of COVID. A lot of primary and secondary tertiary cold storage has been created. I don't see a depth of that, but the software is developed now, digitalized some of the vaccination program. It's good. But I think, what is important is if COVID vaccine is required for the entire population, that's a decision the government has to take place, and that means 1.3 billion population need to be vaccinated. So that's going to be a Herculean task, but it's going to be challenging, and I think country can achieve that.
Okay, still keeping an eye on how things are shaping up for the rest of the market, which is doing quite buoyantly, as we've been telling you. In fact, it's growing with its gains. 2,200-point rally on the Sensex today. So this will certainly close up as a fantastic session. Just keep an eye out on the news with petrol and diesel. As I said earlier, it looks like there's an agriculture, infra and development cess that's been put on petrol and diesel. The special excise duty has been cut, but there is, this cess that's been introduced. So I think we'll wait for some more details on that. Dr. Ella, now that we have you with us, perhaps you could also update us on how things are progressing with Covaxin, with specific reference to phase 3 trials and generally the rollout across the country as well.
I think we completed 80% of the second dose right now. So the epidemic is a little down. So we're expecting sometime in March, we should be having the data.
And when is it that, internally your indications of providing this in the private market as well, of course, having cleared the phase 3 trials?
I mean, we don't have yet the permission, but we can do the private marketing based on the same informed consent, like Apollo can do with informed consent, that type of things they can do it. But right now, we want to understand what the government wants it and fulfill what the government requires. And I think we're also scaling up the production capacity, because it's not an easy. Vaccine field is not an easy. Some platforms are very easy, like mRNA vaccine and all that. But traditional vaccines are very difficult to scale up. So we are now scaling up capacities.
Sunita, what would you want to see as a 2 or 3 point agenda for health, in the next couple of quarters? Because, it's taken such a long time to even get to here in terms of increasing spend. Now that we've got the government's attention, what is it that you want to see in terms of prioritization over the next few months?
I think prioritization is really